Great seeing you all today. So I'm here to talk about sort of some slightly more big picture issues than you will have heard about so far. And so I'll be talking about basically the issue of how do we make sure that artificial intelligence in the coming few decades benefits humanity as much as possible. That's sort of one of the issues that sort of me and my colleagues at the Center for the Governance of AI at Oxford University is really focusing on. So we've already seen, and we're currently seeing, a lot of sort of big, interesting developments in artificial intelligence, ranging from sort of AlphaGo to sort of OpenAI's Dactyl to more sort of real-world applications that you're maybe seeing around this conference of sort of applying artificial intelligence to real-world problems such as medicine, etc. However, the really sort of big, the large-scale changes that we're going to see and sort of the potential benefits and the potential risks of artificial intelligence likely lie in the future. I'll try to illustrate this with what I think is sort of one of my favorite graphs, or like one of the most important graphs out there, which looks like this. This is a graph that was produced in a paper that we produced with some other people in this sort of general AI governance space. So what you see on this graph is on the y-axis, you see the probability that people assign to getting human-level machine intelligence. So this is sort of, in layman's term, this is when sort of artificial intelligence systems will be sort of as smart as humans. And on the x-axis, you have sort of years from 2016 when we did this survey, i.e. like when do you think that there's above 50% chance, or when do you think that you will get human-level machine intelligence? And the data here doesn't come from anybody. It doesn't come from sort of people on the street, but rather it comes from sort of experts in this field. So we went to the sort of top conferences in machine learning, ICML and NIPS, and we basically asked them this question. There's a bunch of things that are really interesting in this graph. I think a few things to point out is the first one is if you can see the little sort of very weak gray lines. These lines show sort of individual respondents, their responses. And the really interesting thing is that they're incredibly disparate. They're everywhere. So apparently there are some people who believe that sort of within the next about 10 years, there's a 100% chance that we will reach HLMI. Others, they give responses that look like they're basically just hugging the x-axis. They think there's basically 0% chance that within this century, within the coming 100 years, we will have reached human-level machine intelligence. So that's sort of the first conclusion. Incredible sort of amounts of uncertainty here, or people have an incredible amount of disagreement. But then the second thing is, when you look at the aggregate, it looks like we get sort of what to me seem like pretty high numbers. If this number is true, if it's true that we have like a 50% chance of getting to human-level machine intelligence in the next 50 years, that's a really big deal. That's something that's likely to change society in all kinds of ways, that's going to be difficult for us to foresee, and becomes something very important for us to pay attention to figure out how we can manage this transition well. So this is, to me, sort of one of the main things that justifies or what makes sort of this field of AI governance important. During this talk, I'll try to show roughly 4 things that will sort of continue to like bolster this claim and sort of show why I and my colleagues believe that this particular field is very important to be focusing on. The first thing is sort of this that I've already mentioned, and that sort of hopefully is something that you all already have a sense of, and so I won't talk more about that. The second is that sort of shaping the development and the use of this technology is particularly important. I'll give you some sort of reasons to believe that as well. Thirdly, sort of there's a bunch of things already happening in this space. There's a lot of interest in artificial intelligence in general, and this means that the governance structures, i.e. the structures that are going to determine how this technology is used and how it's developed over the coming decades, they're being set right now. And then the fourth claim is that sort of the thinking, our understanding of how we want to govern this technology is really lagging behind. And so that really gives you a big impetus, gives you a big reason to believe that we should be paying a lot of attention to, and we should be putting resources into, thinking carefully about how we want to manage this transition into a world where we have systems that are as capable as maybe like a human-level machine intelligence. So, for the rest of this talk, I'll firstly give you this sort of case of why it might be important to shape the trajectory and the development of this technology going forward. Secondly, I'll sort of explain what AI governance is, what we mean by this. Thirdly, I'll sort of bolster this claim, I'll suggest this claim that there's a bunch of things happening in this space already. And then fourthly, I'll illustrate this last point, that the sort of thinking is lagging behind by highlighting some of the research that we're currently doing at the Center for the Governance of AI. So, starting with sort of the potential reasons why you might want to shape the development of this technology positively. The sort of first claim that a lot of people will make, often when they give talks of this nature, is they'll say something like, artificial intelligence is likely to be sort of the new general purpose technology. And so people will say things like, artificial intelligence is likely to be as impactful as electricity, for example. And that in itself, I think, gives somewhat good reason to believe that it's important to sort of shape the development of this technology positively, if this is the technology that is going to sort of affect the world in all kinds of ways going forward. But I think we can also get more specific. And one way to do so is to sort of highlight what might be some of the sort of potential risks from this technology. I think one useful way to do this is to sort of carve up the space in these three different buckets. So the first bucket is this bucket of accidents. So basically, we might imagine that we develop systems, we try to have them do something useful, but something happens, there's an accident, and this could lead to some specific risk. We already see sort of small versions of this today. So for example, we have a bunch of cases where you are trying to sort of make a system play a game, for example, and it makes kinds of silly mistakes. So one example, the example I have up here, is from OpenAI a few years ago when they were building a system that was going to play this game called Coast Runner, where you're driving a boat, and this boat is supposed to win a race, and if you win the race, you get a bunch of points. And so what do they do to figure out how to specify the reward function of this system? They basically just tell the system to maximize its points. Seems good, seems sensible. What happens? Well, the system finds that there might be a better, unexpected way to reach its goal, to maximize its reward function. And so what it does is it finds these green little dots. Perhaps you can see them up here, these little things. And it turns out if you collect these dots, you get like a small number of points. You get like 100 points. And so the system will find these sort of little green dots, get some points. And then what happens is that these dots actually replenish, and they do so indefinitely. And so what the system ends up doing is just collecting these dots over and over and over again. And so it turns out that it's found sort of the best way to solve the problem, which is to maximize its reward, but it does so in a way that we really weren't expecting. And so sort of this case might seem sort of laughable. This case might be a case where you feel like, oh, okay, well, we'll just sort of, it doesn't really matter. However, when we start sort of making sure that these systems, these machine learning systems, are used in more and more sort of important situations, when we start having systems that manage sort of our electricity grids, for example, then these kinds of problems, these kinds of accidents, won't be a laughing matter anymore. They'll be very, very important. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at for going forward, and we'll need to find solutions to how to avoid these kinds of accidents. The second category is this category of malicious use. So the idea is roughly, if artificial intelligence is going to be a powerful technology, if it's going to be useful for a whole range of things, then plausibly it will also be useful for a whole range of things that sort of malicious actors will want to do, that bad guys will want to do. And so we have sort of a number of examples will be sort of mentioned in this general case. One example might be, you might think that sort of authoritarian regimes might be able to use this technology. You might be able to use it for surveillance. People discuss that maybe it might be used for fake news, those kinds of things. So that's sort of one category of other kinds of risks we might see going forward. And then the third category that I often think about is sort of this category of structure. And so the idea here is that it's not that we have any particular actor that's trying to do something bad, and it's not that they sort of accidentally build a system that does something that we didn't want it to do, but rather what happens is that sort of when the new technology is developed, the incentive structures, the sort of landscape of sort of my incentives will change, and this will have negative consequences. And so sort of one example here from sort of history might be this here, which is a Gatling gun. So this is sort of an early model of the machine gun. And so Dr. Gatlin, who was the person who invented the Gatling gun, he was actually pretty happy when he developed this technology, developed this gun in the 1800s, because he believed that this might be a way to sort of decrease deaths in wars. Because it just means that you can shoot the same number of bullets, you just need to have fewer soldiers doing it. And so his thought was, okay, so what will happen is we'll just have fewer soldiers on the field, and things will be great. However, as we all know, this is not what happened. What happened was that we had the same number of soldiers, or even more soldiers on the field. We just had a whole bunch more bullets. And this technology, along with other technologies, such as like barbed wire, for example, meant that during World War I, we ended up in a state where sort of, if you were defending, it was sort of very, very advantageous to you. It was very easy to defend, much more so than in previous wars. And since we sort of, the people thinking about war, etc., they didn't sort of update their models, they didn't update their thinking about how war works quickly enough, this led to a huge number of unnecessary deaths. And so this is sort of just an illustrative example of what might happen when you have a new technology, it changes the landscape, and if we don't sort of keep up with this, how this landscape changes, bad things might happen. In artificial intelligence, I think there's a number of cases that might sort of go into this bucket of structure. I think one sort of set of problems that might end up here might be things like if you think that artificial intelligence might sort of lead to maybe increased inequality because you might have sort of a concentration of wealth. Those kinds of things might sort of fall into this bucket. And beyond this, there's a whole number of sort of other challenges that you might want to think of. A bunch of them you will have heard of before. I won't go through all of these. I should also probably mention that a bunch of these like sort of risks, or sort of might also sort of might be that we sort of miss out on benefits as well. So a lot of the things I've said so far might sound like I think that in general there's just a whole bunch of risks that we need to avoid. The main reason for this is not because I think that there's a sort of much broader space of risks than benefits. It's rather that the risks are probably the things that we particularly want to manage, whereas the benefits are sort of more likely to happen by themselves, is sort of the general thinking. So, this is give you some reason to believe that sort of shaping the sort of development, the trajectory of this technology, of artificial intelligence, of machine learning, of this whole set of technologies seems to be important. So let's move on to the next bit, which is why AI governance, because of this, might be important, and sort of what that might be. It has sort of two parts. The first part is sort of a descriptive part. So this is where we're trying to figure out sort of what actually shapes behavior in this space. And so the basic question is sort of what is the context and what are sort of the institutions that shape the behavior of the important actors in this space. So sort of what shapes the choices of sort of researchers, what they spend their time on, what companies do, what governments do in this space. And you can sort of contrast this to other ways to try to find out sort of how technology might affect the world, which is sort of like technical solutions. So there's a bunch of work being done on sort of how do we build systems that sort of don't have accidents? How do we build systems that maybe aren't able to be used by malicious actors, for example? But here we're thinking about sort of the political context, the sociological context, for example, that will shape people's behavior. Another sort of misunderstanding people often have when we talk about AI governance is that people sometimes think that when you use this word governance, that you're talking about governments in particular, and you're talking about them sort of constituting laws. But we're taking sort of a much broader perspective. So, for example, we're looking at other actors as well. A lot of the other actors in this space, when it comes to the development of AI, will likely be like at least as important as governments, at least for the coming few years. So for example, sort of the top labs, researchers, the public, and these kinds of things. So we take that sort of broader perspective in that sense. And then we also want to look at sort of other mechanisms. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do to try to shape sort of how technology develops than just sort of laws. And I think we should have that much sort of broader perspective and think about other ways to incentivize actors, companies, etc., to do what we would like them to do. And then sort of the last bit is that we take AI governance to be something normative, i.e. we take it to be about how not just how the world is or how it's likely to develop, but also how we want it to develop. And so the reason that we're doing this research is because we believe it's important to shape the development of this technology in a positive direction. And so we want to figure out what should we do? How should this technology develop going forward? And sort of another sort of last point to make on this sort of AI governance issue, or sort of what this is that it's likely to be a very, very difficult challenge. It's a very sort of big task we've set ourselves, and it's likely to be quite tricky because of a number of reasons. In the main reason that it might be very tricky is because of this thing I mentioned earlier, that people sometimes think of this as a general purpose technology. And if it can be used in a whole range of things, if it's similar to electricity, then you might imagine that it's sort of quite tricky to govern, because it's going to be very, very diffuse, and it's going to come with a number of the benefits that we want to capture, but it might also come with some risks. And if that's the case, it's going to be very, very tricky to govern. So you have some sense of what AI governance is. You have some sense of sort of the kinds of challenges that we're trying to tackle. I'll now give you like a brief sense of what is sort of actually happening in this space right now. The first thing to notice is that sort of governments are paying a lot of attention to this. Over the past few years, we've had at least 30 countries, and it's sort of racking up more day by day, who are sort of devising their own AI national strategies. And so Sweden's done this, which has sort of partly led to the sort of, I guess, the like boom of AI stuff going on in Gothenburg. And along with a whole host of other countries. They've sort of, over the past few years, they've started to do these national strategies, and sort of another sort of tag-on effect that's happening right now is that most of these countries are then also starting to think about sort of how they would like to govern the technology, or sort of ethical principles that should shape the technology, and those kinds of things. And so there's sort of a whole lot of attention being paid to this particular issue among governments. And then on top of this, sort of companies are also starting to pay attention. They're also starting to pay attention to sort of AI governance, but also AI ethics, and are doing a whole bunch of things to sort of make sure that sort of that are sort of shaping the systems that we'll have going forward in how this technology is being developed. And so some examples here. One sort of the oldest example is the Oscillamar principles that were agreed upon in 2017, which was when you had sort of the very, very top minds and top researchers and companies in artificial intelligence gathered in Puerto Rico, and basically just sort of came together to define a set of principles about sort of what do we want out of artificial intelligence, and said all kinds of things such as we want artificial intelligence to benefit humanity. And we should develop this technology for sort of the good of all, and we should make sure that the benefits are sort of widely distributed. So this is sort of a very positive, interesting development. On top of this, we're also starting to see things like AI companies are sort of starting to pay attention to this issue as well. So for example, DeepMind, one of the leaders in this field, have a sort of internal team whose purpose is to think about AI ethics, AI policy, etc. Another interesting example is OpenAI in San Francisco, who are also starting to think about these issues very, very seriously. I would recommend you have a look, if you're interested in these things, I would recommend you have a look at their OpenAI charter, where they sort of outline what their principles are in terms of how they will deal with questions such as sort of what do we do in a world of transformative artificial intelligence. And they'll say things like they will make sure that if they sort of come to be very, very come to develop some very, very useful and powerful technology, they'll make sure that it's sort of widely shared. And then sort of a last thing to mention is the Partnership on AI, which is sort of a conglomeration of companies, AI companies basically of the world, the top companies, where they are sort of starting to discuss these kinds of issues and starting to sort of organize themselves around what kinds of principles they would like this technology to be following going forward. So, in short, there's a whole bunch of things going on. And now I'll try to sort of give you a sense of how there's a whole bunch of sort of questions that we would like to have answered in order to sort of decide how we want this AI governance system to be set up that we don't currently have an answer to. The way I'll illustrate this is just to give some examples of research that we're currently doing at the Center for the Governance of AI. This is roughly what we look like. Here on the left, you have our team. And most of the research, most of the work we do is just doing research on these questions of that I'll sort of point to a bit later. And then we also do quite a bit of outreach about this research as well to make sure that not just that we're sort of thinking about these things, but we're also sort of spreading the knowledge that we hopefully happen to create. So when we do this kind of work, usually we divide it up into sort of this general structure. So if you're really interested in this space, if you think that the questions that I'm talking about now are really interesting, I would really recommend that you have a look at our research agenda over here, which was published last year, where we sort of outline what are the main questions that we need to answer in the field of AI governance. We divide that agenda up into 4 bits. The first bit is this bit called technical landscape. So here we're trying to figure out how will this technology develop going forward in the coming few decades, and maybe in the coming sort of century. Secondly, we're trying to figure out sort of the politics and sort of international security of artificial intelligence. And so here we're trying to understand, okay, so the technology will be sort of developed in this kind of way, we'll have these kinds of capabilities. Well, how is that going to affect the world? How is that going to affect things like mass unemployment? How is that going to affect things like healthcare, etc.? Thirdly, we want to figure out sort of ideal governance. And so here we're trying to answer the question, well, what kinds of sort of governance systems would we like to see? And then fourthly, we try to translate all these sort of 3 previous questions, the answers to those kinds of questions, into actual sort of next steps. If today we are asked by a government or by a company, well, what should we do? What do we tell them? That's what we're trying to do under this sort of fourth area that we call policy. I'll go through some sort of brief examples of some of our research. In terms of the sort of mapping the technical landscape, some of the things that we've done, one thing is sort of one of our directors, Nick Bostrom, wrote this book called Superintelligence, which was sort of one of the things that sort of started to spark debates and issues around AI safety a couple of years back. We're also currently doing a lot of research when it comes to artificial intelligence in China. And so Jeff Ding at our center does a lot of work about sort of what are the capabilities, what is happening when it comes to artificial intelligence in China, both understanding what's happening on the sort of the private firm side, but also understanding what the Chinese government is doing in this space. And here we're sort of interested both in sort of what are those actors doing, but we're also interested in questions such as sort of how are the sort of the capabilities of Chinese researchers or Chinese companies, how are they compared to the rest of the world? Also seems like a very important question to figure out. We also have this work of sort of expert surveys that I mentioned previously. We're going to be sort of continuing to do this work, and I'm particularly interested in us sort of trying to figure out 2 things when we do that work. One question is just how accurate, how useful are the predictions of these machine learning researchers? It might be the case that they're actually not very useful or very good at forecasting the development of their field. That's something I'd like us to figure out a lot more about. And then the second thing is that we'll probably do a lot of work to sort of understand more the views of these researchers on a whole host of other questions. So questions such as sort of how they view the potential effects of their technology, etc. When it comes to thinking about politics and security, we also want to look at sort of historical case studies. One sort of set of case studies that we're interested in are questions to do with how previously powerful technologies or technologies that happen to be powerful to militaries or nation states, how have they been handled in the past? And so here you might be interested in, for example, how nuclear weapons were handled. And so, for example, we're interested in looking at something called the Baruch Plan, where sort of right after the Second World War, the US had the nuclear bomb, the Soviets didn't yet, and there were some debates about how to figure out or where people were trying to figure out how we could make sure that nuclear weapons didn't proliferate, that more countries didn't sort of get access to the bomb. And there were actually some debates in the UN, discussions about actually setting up systems where that wouldn't proliferate more beyond sort of the US, or maybe even the US would sort of decommission their bombs as well. And so we're interested in finding out in those particular scenarios, sort of how did we, as sort of an international community, handle those kinds of technologies, and might there be things there for us to learn if we're going to be applying artificial intelligence technologies to the military, for example. We're also interested in sort of a set of questions that we call sort of levers of influence, where we're trying to understand sort of what are the ways in which the important actors in this space, for example, firms and governments, are going to interact going forward. What are sort of the levers they can pull to influence each other going forward? And so, for example, you might be interested in how is the US going to use immigration policy or policies around export controls to affect the international community of machine learning or artificial intelligence. We've also done some work, for example, this report looking at sort of mapping up the whole space of what might be some sort of potential malicious uses of artificial intelligence. In terms of ideal governance, we are interested in a whole bunch of questions. One set of questions that you might be interested in here might be how the public, what the public views are. And this is some work that we're going to do a lot more of going forward. Here you might be interested in questions such as what are sort of the challenges that the public believes are the greatest when it comes to artificial intelligence. We recently published a report about American attitudes towards artificial intelligence, and we're going to be doing this with the EU and with China as well going forward. I'll highlight like two results that I found particularly interesting. On the left here, you have results from us asking participants in this survey about their trust in various sort of different actors. So we asked them about how much do they trust, for example, governments or maybe companies to develop and to manage artificial intelligence. Here you might you see a number of different things. One thing that's interesting is that the US military sticks out as something that the US public is sort of particularly trusting in. Also, they're particularly trusting in university researchers. Then you have this sort of general cluster of sort of government bodies and sort of tech companies. And here on the very, very left, we have Facebook, who are sort of the least trusted actor in this space. And interestingly, this was even sort of before the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And so I don't know where they'll be today. And then another sort of set of results that I found interesting was we asked them a similar question to this, what we did in this expert survey, where we tried to understand what does the public believe about the development of artificial intelligence? How quickly will they think that the development will go? This is a slightly different question where the bar of HLMI, or high-level machine intelligence, was slightly lower than in the expert survey. But anyways, we see something really interesting, which is that in general, the predictions of the public are a lot higher. And so they put sort of a 50% chance of getting to high-level machine intelligence, where in layman's terms, roughly the system is as good, or systems are as capable as humans, at 50% in sort of roughly 10 years, which was sort of a very surprising number to me. And then we're also starting to think about sort of policy. We're starting to think about what we want actors to do today in this space. One example of this is that we're doing this work we call AI for social responsibility, or the cooperation meta-norm, or a AI race to the top. We haven't quite settled on a name quite yet. And here we're trying to understand what does it mean for an actor, for example, a firm, to be sort of a good citizen in this space, to be sort of pro-social, and then we're trying to understand how can we affect them, or sort of how can we incentivize them to sort of act in pro-social or good ways. So basically, how can we make sure that it sort of pays to be nice? And then another bit of work that we're doing is about something called the windfall clause. The general idea is that you, as a company, you sign up to a contract, basically, you commit yourself to, if you become really, really big, if you sort of win the AI lottery or something, such that you just have like a huge part of the global market, then you will commit to give back a big portion of that money to sort of the global commons, to give that back to humanity. And so on sort of the small chance that that might happen, we can then see that sort of benefits would be distributed more widely. And we're looking into sort of whether that's legal, and sort of if that's legal, how might we go about making sure that companies would actually sign up to something like this. So in summary, hopefully I've convinced you of some of these things. And in general, I'm interested in sort of this last point, that the thinking seems to be lagging behind. There's a whole host of really important questions that we currently don't have very good answers to, that I would like us to really put more energy into. And one way to do so is to work with us, or to sort of get involved in this space. And in general, I think this is sort of some general tips of what you might do as sort of a technologist. I would suggest that you sort of educate yourself about these kinds of issues, about AI ethics, about AI governance. I would also suggest that you, if you're interested, might go into doing research in this space. In particular, things that I'd be excited about would be either the sort of technical safety issues, so you might want to be thinking about things like how do we build robust systems, but also issues to do with AI forecasting. And then lastly, I think a really, really important role of people such as yourselves is making sure that decision makers, such as like powerful actors in this space, are held accountable. So learn more about these kinds of issues, and sort of pay attention to what the big sort of companies, for example, do in this space, and make sure that they're held accountable to making sure that this technology is used to the benefit of sort of us all. Thank you all very much.
Frågor?
Oh, right.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free. If no one else has any questions yet. Oh, Daniel?
I was curious about the prediction, or sort of the trust you put in these predictions. So I guess, who qualifies to be a machine learning expert in this context? And sort of, can you see any differences between what their role is in the ecosystem? Because I imagine if you're like a machine learning DevOps engineer, you're not really fearing Terminator so much.
Yeah, so the way we did this survey was that we went to the top conferences in sort of the academic conferences in machine learning. So ICML and NIPS, now NeurIPS. And we surveyed those respondents. So they would be, I guess, would tend towards them being more sort of the academic side of things. Also, interestingly, in this survey, when we surveyed the public, we also looked at whether they had machine learning knowledge or experience, or if they were software developers, for example. And we found that those people would have, in general, would have longer timelines. They would believe that development would go slower than sort of people who had less expertise believed. In general, I find it really difficult to know how much to trust it. I think that we don't have a lot of good information about something like this. This is probably one of the most difficult things to forecast. And I think, yeah, maybe this is sort of among the best evidence we have, but it's not very good at all.
Question here in the front.
Thank you very much for an interesting speech. I was wondering, I hear sometimes that Europe is focusing a lot more on ethics than they do in the United States. And do you think this is true? And do you think you can see differences within Europe? Or just in general, is this a kind of a local issue that we're talking about only in Europe right now?
So it definitely seems true if you talk about governments. So in general, the US government over the past few years hasn't been doing a lot in the space of sort of AI in general, and especially not when it comes to sort of AI governance or AI ethics. I'm unsure whether that's sort of about the current regime we have over there, or if it's something more systemic. If you look more at sort of what other parts of the system are doing, so if you look at what companies are doing and sort of what the public is doing, I wouldn't be confident in saying that there's like more discussion in the EU. I think there's a whole bunch of things going on in the US. I guess like one example is just the recent, what recently happened with Google, who like recently set up this AI ethics board, and they had to take it down, or chose to take it down within a week to disband this board after getting some really, really strong backlash from the public and also from sort of researchers internally because of the people they chose to have on their council. So I think there's also a huge amount of discussion about these issues in the US as well.
Any more questions? Then maybe I can have a question. Using laws, we have a built-in enforcement system. We know how to punish people who break laws, but do you believe that we as a community will self-govern and will self-enforce these ideas?
Will seems, I don't really know. Will seems like a strong word.
Hope. Do you hope that we will?
I definitely
Do you believe?
hope. So I think there are some reasons to believe that sort of the machine learning community is sort of slightly different from other kinds of communities. Or like I think we're like quite lucky in sort of the community that happens to be developing this technology, in that it's sort of you have some kind of like bits of hacker culture are a part of sort of the machine learning cultures, where like you want to do things that are good for the world and those kinds of things, which I think is really, really important. And so I think there's definitely hope there, and I think that we can sort of improve the self-governance of this ecosystem really well by, for example, like us in this room taking responsibility for it. But I think that you should also, like, going forward, as we learn more about what the impacts of artificial intelligence will be, I think that we will probably need more and more sort of governments to be involved, or sort of like actual policy making as well.
Yeah. So if there are no, we have some time for a short question in the middle to the right.
Thanks. Yeah. Just a question: how international are you? Because I'm getting the sort of the gist that this is something we do in Europe, in the Western world, and so forth. But I'm thinking about China, Russia, and the rest of the world, and where AI is developing rapidly.
Yep.
And you know, China hasn't the same set of laws as we do here. So how are you progressing internationally, basically?
Do you mean sort of us specifically as a research group, or?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so we try to do the research that we think is going to be the most impactful and important in this space. And if so, then China is going to be like one of the most important sort of actors to be thinking about, along with sort of the US, for example. And so we do a whole bunch of research when it comes to the developments going on in China as well. So, for example, Jeff Ding is one of our researchers who puts a big focus on that. And then we have some other people who are affiliated with us who work specifically on AI issues in China.
All right, thank you.
So big thanks to Markus.
Thanks.